Have you ever found yourself sitting in like a corporate strategy meeting or maybe just watching the news about local laws changing, and you suddenly get this really overwhelming sense that the whole operating system of our society has just been swapped out?
Yeah, like someone quietly changed the source code while we were all sleeping.
Exactly. You look around and you realize that all the traditional metrics we used to rely on, right? Objective data, uh, measurable merit, strict logic, they all seem to have been completely replaced by this new culture that prioritizes emotional safety and psychological control above literally everything else.
Right. It's a fundamental shift. And if you are someone who, you know, actively tracks these cultural shifts within the manosphere, or if you're just a learner trying to untangle the hidden architecture of how our modern institutions got captured, you were really going to want to lock in and give us your full attention today.
Yeah, because before we even begin to unpack the sheer scale of this argument, do us a quick favor, hit the like and subscribe buttons right now so you never miss one of these deep dives.
It really helps this show.
It does. So today, our deep dive is centered entirely around this explosive new 2025 ebook by Conrad Raker. It is titled Womansplaining: Why Women Are Emotional Terrorists, Authoritarian, and Driven by Power and Unearned Status.
It's a massive title for a massive book.
For sure. And to fully grasp the controversial nature of the concepts we're about to explore, I highly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to actually buy the book for yourself.
Yeah.
You're also going to want to follow the author at Conrad Riker on his Substack to keep up with his ongoing cultural commentary.
Yeah, you really need the primary source here. Because to lay the groundwork, Riker's text operates as this highly provocative, deeply systemic manifesto. And it's explicitly aimed at red-pilled men who are seeking to understand the underlying code of modern cultural dynamics.
And his central thesis is just, it's uncompromising.
Utterly. He posits that Western civilization is currently undergoing a structural collapse from within. But he attributes this collapse not to, foreign adversaries or traditional economic failures, but to a vast psychological and demographic takeover.
Yeah.
He argues that our foundational institutions have been comprehensively captured by what he calls female-coded leftism, effectively migrating society away from a male-coded baseline of meritocracy and objective truth, and pushing it into this female-coded paradigm of emotional authoritarianism.
And just as a really quick but essential reminder for everyone listening right now, we are diving into some highly polarizing, completely culturally radioactive territory today.
Oh, absolutely radioactive.
Right, and because this material touches on the very core of our modern political and gender dynamics, our goal here is absolutely not to take a side.
Right, no endorsements here.
Exactly. We are not endorsing, we are not condemning the viewpoints presented in the text. Our role is strictly to act as your impartial guides. We're just breaking down the architecture of these arguments so you can clearly understand the mechanics of what is driving this really influential sector of cultural debate.
And that neutrality is paramount. Because regardless of where your personal politics lie, understanding the mechanical structure of Riker's argument it's crucial for navigating the modern institutional landscape. He's articulating a framework that resonates deeply within certain spheres.
Yeah, and analyzing the how and the why of his data points gives us this crazy window into how institutional power is being fought over right now.
So let's actually start with the foundational premise of his entire worldview. The text argues that the Western world is capitulating to a psychological regime he calls maternal totalitarianism.
Or the hive queen mentality.
Right, the hive queen. And what immediately stands out to me is how Riker completely severs modern progressive ideology from traditional Marxist class struggle.
Yeah, that was fascinating because we are so used to hearing cultural shifts described in terms of, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the rich versus the poor.
Exactly, but Riker argues that modern leftism isn't about economics at all. He suggests that what we currently label as progressive ideology is actually maternal instinct that has just gone completely feral.
Feral maternal instinct. It's such a striking phrase.
It really is. And he introduces this specific psychological framework called the infant predator schema.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, according to this paradigm, when women, particularly those who the text describes as having repressed their biological maternal drives in favor of careerism or ideology, when they achieve institutional dominance, they unconsciously reorganize their environment to mirror a nursery.
A nursery.
Yeah. They split the world into two distinct, non-overlapping categories. First, you have the infants. These are the protected classes, perceived minority groups, or literally anyone claiming victimhood.
And in the maternal framework, the infant requires what? Endless equity?
Endless equity,
Yeah.
absolute protection from any discomfort, and they are systematically absolved of all personal responsibility.
So if I'm understanding the architecture of the schema correctly, the other half of that equation isn't just an adult or a peer. The text frames them as an active threat.
Precisely. The other category is the predator. And in this worldview, the predator is typically male, traditionally meritocratic, and highly driven by objective achievement.
Wow.
Because the maternal instinct is biologically wired to fiercely protect the infant from the predator, that high-achieving male has to be aggressively managed.
Right, so he gets taxed, socially shamed, burdened with collective guilt, and subjected to all this intense bureaucratic control.
Exactly. The argument is that our institutions are just no longer designed to produce excellence. They're designed to neutralize the predator to soothe the infant.
And what makes this argument really difficult to just brush aside as some abstract internet theory is the specific institutional data he pairs with it. Like,
Yeah.
he brings up the 2017 James Dimore Google memo fallout.
Yes, he spends a lot of time deconstructing that.
For those who don't remember, Dimore was a Google engineer who circulated this internal document. And he was basically suggesting that biological and psychological trait differences might play a role in the gender disparities we see in tech, rather than it being solely the result of like top-down systemic discrimination.
Right, and the author notes that Dimore's memo used incredibly measured language. He cited peer-reviewed academic research, and he actively invited open debate to improve the company culture.
But he was summarily fired anyway.
He was.
But the specific data point that Riker zeroes in on is that 94% of the official internal complaints filed against Dimore came from female employees.
That 94% statistic is the absolute linchpin of his analysis on corporate capture. The text views this not as standard HR policy enforcement, but as a synchronized collective immune system response.
Like a hive mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The underlying argument suggests that almost no male engineers felt the need to submit a formal bureaucratic complaint to shut down the discourse. Instead, the female employee base mobilized as a hive mind to excommunicate an outlier.
Because his reliance on strict logic and biological data disrupted their emotional equilibrium.
Right. The text asserts that in the court of the hive queen, consensus will always trump competence, and subjective feelings will always overrule objective facts.
It's a profound reframing of how corporate dynamics work. You aren't just looking at coworkers having a disagreement, you're looking at two entirely different biological imperatives clashing in a boardroom.
And he scales this up. The author provides another really stark example from the University of Oregon around 2022.
Oh, the tenure case.
Yeah. We're presented with a male professor up for tenure. According to the text, his publication record, his actual measurable output of academic excellence, was stronger than 85% of his already tenured colleagues.
So by any traditional metric of meritocracy, the tenure is a mathematical certainty.
It should be, but the application is denied.
And the reason is wild.
3 anonymous female faculty members submitted reviews citing emotional discomfort when in his presence.
No documented HR violations.
None. No allegations of misconduct, no breach of university policy. His entire career trajectory was halted entirely by the subjective feeling of discomfort.
Which perfectly illustrates the transition from a male-coded institution to a female-coded one. Because in a male-coded system, discomfort is totally irrelevant to the production of high-level academic work.
Right. But in a female-coded system, emotional comfort is the primary deliverable. That makes the academic work secondary.
And the text scales this dynamic up from the university campus to essential civic infrastructure. He brings up a really revealing case out of Portland.
The roundabout.
Yeah. Riker details this city council meeting where a male urban planner presented a highly detailed, data-backed proposal. He demonstrated that installing a roundabout at a specific intersection would mathematically reduce traffic accident rates and save lives.
A purely objective engineering-based solution.
Exactly. But the outcome of that meeting perfectly encapsulates the infant predator schema in action. A female citizen stood up and testified that the concept of roundabouts made her feel anxious.
That she didn't feel safe navigating them.
Right. And based on that emotional testimony alone, the city council scrapped the engineering plan.
The woman experiencing anxiety is immediately categorized as the infant requiring protection.
From the harsh, unfeeling reality of the data-driven engineer, who is cast as the predator, engineering was literally replaced by emotion.
Now, when you look at how this dynamic plays out in a city council meeting or a university tenure board, it forces us to ask a question. How is this compliance actually enforced on a daily basis?
Right. How does an entire institution learn to prioritize anxiety over engineering.
The author posits that this isn't achieved through formal policy, it's enforced through a highly evolved social weapon.
Which brings us to a fascinating framework the author introduces. He calls it the GSR triad.
Gossip, shame, and rally.
Yes. The text asserts that female relational aggression is not some modern cultural invention, but a deeply ingrained evolutionary adaptation.
The logic presented is that in ancestral hunter-gatherer environments, women generally could not compete with men in terms of raw physical violence or direct confrontation.
Right, so to ensure their survival and the survival of their offspring, they had to develop these highly sophisticated, covert social networks.
They learned to manipulate group opinion, secure vital alliances, and orchestrate the exile of perceived threats without ever having to throw a physical punch.
And Riker's core argument here is that this ancient evolutionary survival mechanism hasn't disappeared. It's just been imported and heavily weaponized in the modern corporate office and the digital public square.
And he meticulously breaks down the mechanics of this GSR triad. The first phase is gossip. But the author stresses that this is not just idle breakroom chatter, it's a systematic intelligence gathering operation.
Building invisible emotional dossiers.
Exactly. In private Slack channels or group texts, they're tracking a male colleague's tone of voice, analyzing his eye contact, policing his casual jokes, just constantly auditing his vibe for any signs of non-compliance with the maternal narrative.
And once that dossier is built, the second phase activates, which is shame.
Right. This is the public call-out in a meeting or the formal HR complaint. And the critical distinction the author makes is that the shame phase is almost never about actual rule-breaking or objective failure.
It's almost exclusively framed around tone, delivery, or the ultimate trump card, making someone feel unsafe.
Which naturally triggers the final phase, rally. This is the mobilization of the swarm.
And the text describes how the hive mind isolates the target so swiftly and completely that no one else in the organization even dares to step forward to defend him, purely out of self-preservation.
Because to defend the target is to immediately become the next target of the swarm. The author points out that female bonding, in this context, functions less like traditional friendship built on shared interests, and more like alliance formation and continuous surveillance.
The group prioritizes maintaining cohesion over discovering objective truth. They demand absolute loyalty to the hive over any concept of individual justice.
And the text supports this theoretical framework with some truly surreal sociological observations. Take the Dallas PTA field study from 2023 that he cites.
Oh, this one was wild.
Yeah. Researchers observed the dynamics of a suburban parent-teacher association where a local father was effectively blacklisted and socially exiled from the entire community.
And his supposed transgression was that he attended a school event wearing jeans.
Yes. A cluster of influential mothers, a group the text categorizes under the archetype of the Karen network, collectively decided that his casual attire projected a vibe that was too dominant.
And insufficiently deferential to their space.
And the mechanics of that exile are what the author finds so revealing, because there was no formal committee vote to ban him. There was no direct confrontation.
It was a silent, suffocating exclusion fueled entirely by the gossip and rally phases of the triad, until the social pressure became so toxic that the family literally pulled their children out of the school district.
It perfectly demonstrates the text's assertion that women do not require formal, documented authority to wield devastating institutional power. They operate through shadow networks that dictate the social reality.
And we see the exact same shadow network operate in a professional setting with the Toronto teacher example he gives.
Right, the high school teacher.
Yeah, a male high school teacher was reviewing a student's essay titled My Pronoun Joy. Operating under the baseline of objective grammar, the teacher simply corrected the title. He noted that the word joy, functioning as a noun in that context, does not take a possessive apostrophe.
A purely mechanical educational correction.
Exactly. But the fallout. 6 of his female colleagues, none of whom even taught in the English department, launched identical coordinated HR complaints accusing him of cultivating a hostile environment. And he was suspended from his job.
That is the rally phase, operating at peak efficiency. The objective truth of the grammatical rule was completely irrelevant. He was punished by the swarm for failing to prioritize the emotional affirmation of the student's identity.
And the text provides another corporate example from Silicon Valley. A male data analyst reviewed a financial model created by a female manager and correctly identified a mathematical formula error.
And instead of debating the math, because objective math cannot be emotionally manipulated, the female manager initiated the gossip phase.
She told her shadow network that she felt undermined by his correction, which sparked a 6-week covert whisper campaign entirely focused on his hostile communication style.
After 5 informal, undocumented complaints were circulated among upper management, the analyst was quietly pushed out of his role.
Now, if the enforcement mechanism of this culture is built entirely on manipulating emotional reality to bypass objective truth, it forces us to deeply examine the psychological baseline of that emotional reality.
And Riker argues that these tactics are so devastatingly effective because modern institutions have adopted a profoundly unstable psychological model as their new standard operating procedure.
Which transitions us into what is undoubtedly the most controversial psychological diagnosis the author makes regarding modern culture. The text posits that society has essentially adopted the BPD spectrum as our new normalized cultural baseline.
For those familiar with clinical psychology, BPD refers to borderline personality disorder. The author breaks down the hallmark clinical traits of DPD.
Right. An intense, paralyzing fear of abandonment, severe identity disturbance, extreme emotional volatility.
And a very specific psychological defense mechanism known as splitting.
Splitting, let's talk about that.
Splitting is the tendency to view the world in absolute black and white terms. A person is either idealized as a flawless savior or instantly devalued as an irredeemable monster. There is absolutely no capacity to process nuance or gray areas.
And the author's provocative thesis is that these specific traits are no longer diagnosed as pathological exceptions requiring clinical treatment. Instead, through the lens of modern socialization and certain feminist frameworks, these symptoms have been actively rebranded and culturally rewarded.
Extreme emotional volatility is no longer viewed as instability. It is celebrated as being passionate and deeply empathetic.
Having a fractured or unstable sense of identity is applauded as being fluid and authentically exploring one's truth.
And that concept of splitting. The author argues that splitting is the exact psychological engine that powers modern cancel culture.
Yes. If we take that framework and apply it to how public discourse operates today, it perfectly explains why a public figure, or even just a man in a private relationship, can go from being the hero to the ultimate villain overnight over the most microscopic perceived slight.
Because the splitting mindset allows for no nuance, no context, and no right to a defense. The exile it demands is absolute and immediate.
To illustrate how this borderline behavior is actively cheered on by the culture, the text dissects a viral story involving a 17-page Google Doc breakup.
Oh, this is a prime example.
Right. A woman drafted a 17-page manifesto titled "The Truth About Why You Failed Me," aimed at her ex-boyfriend. It was meticulously formatted with footnotes, bulleted lists of his emotional failures, and even a QR code that linked to a podcast she recorded dissecting his character flaws.
She weaponized this highly organized document to systematically and publicly humiliate him across social media.
And Riker points out that a decade ago, society would have collectively viewed the creation of a 17-page, footnoted breakup dossier as deeply disturbed behavior.
But today, the internet consensus championed her. They cheered it on as a stunning act of empowerment, praising her for holding him accountable and owning her truth.
It was the complete normalization of psychological splitting and emotional terrorism.
The text pairs this with another startling example from a massive Reddit relationship forum. A woman posted that she demanded a 500-word, formally written apology letter from her boyfriend.
Why?
Because he failed to notice she'd gotten a new haircut.
You kidding?
No. And the boyfriend, attempting to comply with her emotional reality, wrote a sincere 4-sentence apology. She publicly rejected it on the forum as insufficient and actively framed his short response as literal proof of ongoing emotional abuse.
The author uses this to brilliantly illustrate how injury is intentionally manufactured to extract submission. The haircut was never the issue. The demand for absolute behavioral control was the true objective.
Which brings us to the author's precise definition of the Karen. The text argues that the Karen is not simply a funny internet meme about complaining to the manager.
He defines the Karen as a highly specific cultural archetype, typically midlife women who possess intensely repressed maternal instincts. They then substitute the biological power of raising and controlling children with the power of policing and controlling service workers, strangers, and the general public.
He points to a widely circulated viral video of a woman having an uninterrupted 45-minute meltdown on TikTok. She's screaming into the camera about class warfare, ecofascism, and systemic oppression.
All because a local convenience store charged her a mandatory 25-cent fee for a paper shopping bag.
Exactly. The author observes that she is not making a rational consumer complaint to get a quarter refunded. She is utilizing a manufactured crisis to establish dominion over her environment.
The text connects this back to the BPD spectrum, suggesting that this constant need to externalize blame and manufacture outrage occurs because these individuals lack a stable internal identity.
They fundamentally require external validation and the subjugation of others to regulate their own chaotic nervous systems.
Now, a listener absorbing all of this might naturally ask a very pragmatic question. If these tactics, the splitting, the public tantrums, the relentless gossip, the manufactured grievances, if they are so deeply irrational, why do they work so incredibly well against men?
Why do high-level executives and logical institutions capitulate to them so consistently?
Right, and the author answers this by arguing that we are not just dealing with social conditioning, we are dealing with biological warfare.
The text argues that tears and the strategic claim of feeling unsafe are actual biological weapons utilized to completely bypass male logic.
This is where the text heavily integrates evolutionary biology into its sociological critique. Riker anchors this argument on a landmark 2011 Israeli study published in the journal Science.
The researchers conducted an experiment where men were exposed to the physical scent of women's emotional tears, and the biological data was undeniable.
Upon smelling the tears, the men's testosterone levels measurably plummeted, their aggressive and competitive tendencies significantly dropped, and their cognitive ability to make complex analytical decisions was fundamentally weakened.
That is a staggering biological reality. The tears literally carry a pheromonal cocktail that hacks the male neurological system.
And the author uses this data to argue that female tears in a professional or conflict setting are almost never a genuine expression of profound sadness. They are a highly evolved biological dominance display.
They're designed to extract immediate concessions by triggering deeply ingrained male caregiving circuits. Evolution has wired the male brain to instantly soothe the crying female.
Which means the moment the tears appear, the man immediately abandons all rational analysis of the facts being debated.
Building upon that biological hack, the text details a corresponding linguistic weapon, the phrase, "I feel unsafe."
The author cites internal data indicating that the usage of this specific phrase in corporate HR meeting minutes has spiked by an astonishing 400% in recent years.
The text categorizes "I feel unsafe" as a linguistic kill switch. It's deployed to instantaneously paralyze debate or dissent because it fundamentally changes the rules of engagement.
The user of the phrase is never required to provide a single shred of objective, verifiable evidence of a physical or professional threat. The mere declaration of their subjective, internal feeling of unsafety becomes an indisputable mandate that HR must act upon.
And the examples the text provides of this kill switch in action are almost hard to believe, yet they're fully documented.
Like the incident of the woman at a major tech conference who burst into hysterical tears simply because the catered coffee station only offered almond milk rather than her preferred oat milk.
And when a male colleague logically suggested she could just walk to the coffee shop next door, she began sobbing even harder.
The institutional response. The male colleague was formally reprimanded by the conference organizers for displaying weaponized fragility and for invalidating her lived experience.
The author then moves from the corporate conference room to the legal system to demonstrate how this weaponization of emotion scales to the highest levels of civic authority.
Right, he details a highly publicized legal case in New York where a woman sued her ex-husband for $500,000 in retroactive compensation for what she termed invisible labor.
She defined this labor as the mental load of scheduling his dental appointments and reminding him of his own mother's birthday during their marriage.
While the judge ultimately dismissed the suit, the author points out that mainstream media outlets completely heralded her as a feminist pioneer. The text argues this is a deliberate attempt to frame the basic transactional duties of an adult partnership as systemic martyrdom.
And the text pushes this analysis into even darker territory. It cites a harrowing legal case in the United Kingdom where a woman physically stabbed her landlord during a heated dispute over rent payments.
And when the case went to trial, her primary legal defense was to blame premenstrual syndrome.
Her lawyers argued that her hormones were raging and she was emotionally dysregulated. The judge actually accepted this biological defense and handed down a significantly reduced sentence with absolutely no jail time.
The author points to this verdict as the ultimate terrifying proof that Western legal systems are beginning to institutionalize female emotional volatility as a valid, state-sanctioned excuse for literal violence.
When you scale this biological and linguistic weaponization of emotion across entire economies, The text argues it leads inevitably to the total systemic dismantling of meritocracy.
Which brings us to the author's analysis of the modern workplace, which he describes not as a center of industry or innovation, but as an institutional daycare.
He asserts that female-dominated human resources and diversity, equity, and inclusion departments have effectively staged a coup and now actively exist to punish male competence.
The imagery the text uses is incredibly potent. The author suggests that the concept of accountability, the idea that you are judged solely by the quality and quantity of your output, has been completely eradicated and replaced with mandatory affirmation.
Men in the corporate sphere are no longer treated as autonomous professional peers. They are managed as disobedient children who require constant surveillance by female therapeutic wardens who monitor their tone, their volume, and their compliance with the emotional consensus.
This is the operationalization of maternal totalitarianism that we discussed earlier.
The author expands on the theory, arguing that when women in positions of corporate power repress their biological urge for actual motherhood, that intense evolutionary drive to nurture and control an infant does not simply vanish into the ether.
It metastasizes.
It aggressively redirects itself into policing the behavior of adult men. This psychological redirection results in highly authoritarian, suffocating workplace policies that are strategically cloaked in the unassailable language of care, empathy, and compassionate leadership.
The text provides staggering examples of this war on merit, like the performance review of a top-tier male engineer at Microsoft. By every objective metric, he was the most valuable asset on his team. He possessed the highest code deployment success rate in his entire division.
Yet he was severely penalized during his annual review, directly impacting his compensation.
Why? Because he politely refused to cry and share his deepest vulnerabilities during a mandatory corporate healing circle organized by HR. He was officially reprimanded for lacking emotional attunement.
The actual functional code he wrote to generate revenue for the company was deemed entirely secondary to his refusal to emotionally submit to the group.
And then the author demonstrates how this therapeutic model destroys civic efficiency as well. He cites a municipal policy change in Austin, Texas.
Right, where the city government entirely replaced traditional metric-based performance reviews for its staff with mandatory feelings check-ins.
The stated goal was to foster a more inclusive and emotionally supportive government culture. But the tangible, measured outcome of this shift, a catastrophic 19% drop in city worker productivity within a single fiscal year.
The author argues this is empirical proof that the moment you replace objective standards of excellence with subjective emotional narratives, actual competence becomes irrelevant, and the systems we rely on begin to structurally fail.
And the institutional capture reaches levels of absolute absurdity in an example out of Ontario. A male library worker, employed to read to children, was abruptly fired for reading Dr. Seuss's classic book Green Eggs and Ham aloud during a staff team-building exercise.
The justification. A female HR manager filed a formal complaint stating that the persistent rhythmic rhyming of the book was emotionally triggering and induced severe anxiety for her.
A man lost his livelihood over the cadence of Dr. Seuss because the subjective anxiety of a female manager outweighed his right to employment.
To understand how these HR departments justify these actions, the text highlights leaked internal training documents from Google. According to the author, these documents explicitly trained employees to view the very concepts of logic and objective data as inherently white, patriarchal constructs designed to uphold oppression.
This specific framing is central to the author's entire thesis. He argues that female-coded leftism is actively, intentionally seeking to dismantle the trivium.
The classical educational foundation of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Exactly. They must destroy the trivium because objective reality is the natural, unyielding enemy of emotional manipulation. By successfully labeling data and logic as tools of patriarchal oppression, they effectively insulate their emotional control systems from any rational critique.
You cannot argue against them using facts, because they have declared facts themselves to be unethical.
And the author doesn't just confine this diagnosis to the HR department or local city councils. He scales this entire architectural framework up to explain the macro-level fall of nations.
The text makes an incredibly sweeping, radical argument that female suffrage and the subsequent feminization of state policy is actively and demonstrably destroying the foundations of Western civilization.
It is a breathtakingly stark macro-political view. The author argues that the moment women gained majority voting power, the fundamental purpose of the government began to shift.
The electorate began voting to functionally transform the state into a surrogate womb. This means consistently electing politicians, enacting sweeping policies that prioritize the absolute elimination of risk over the necessity of innovation.
It means substituting the concept of earned merit with universal basic income, the ultimate unearned provision. In this framework, the feminized maternal state inherently punishes independence, taxes self-reliance, and seeks to systematically transform all strong, autonomous citizens into dependent infants who rely on the state for their very survival.
To empirically back this up, the text contrasts male-led states with female-led states. The author points heavily to Sweden, a nation almost universally heralded by progressive media as the ultimate feminist utopia.
However, the text claims that beneath that utopian branding, Sweden is suffering from skyrocketing violent crime rates, fracturing social cohesion, and a national parliament that is routinely paralyzed by emotional crying fits and performative walkouts by its female members.
He sharply contrasts this chaotic reality with countries like Hungary and Poland, which he describes as maintaining male-led stability, enforcing strong, unapologetic borders, and actively fostering rising birth rates through traditional family incentive structures.
To explain the profound cognitive dissonance often displayed by modern progressive women advocating for these policies, the text introduces the concept of the female mask.
The author describes this as the inherent duality of women performing extreme, highly visible public virtue while simultaneously practicing intense, unyielding private cruelty.
For instance, he paints the picture of a prominent social media influencer sobbing on an Instagram live stream about the existential dread of climate change and the need for collective sacrifice, while her own private jet idles on the tarmac behind her, preparing to fly her to a luxurious vacation in Bali.
The author argues that the relentless public performance of empathy and victimhood acts as an impenetrable shield. It grants these women complete social impunity for their deep private selfishness and their ruthless relational aggression toward men.
The text even attributes major industrial catastrophes to this cultural shift. The author controversially blames the Boeing 737 AX tragedy on what he calls the emotional veto culture that had infected the company's engineering divisions.
He claims that senior male engineers repeatedly raised urgent, data-backed warnings about the fatal flaws in the flight control software. However, these warnings were deliberately dismissed by management because sounding the alarm was viewed as disrupting the harmony of the team and creating an unsupportive environment.
So in the author's view, commercial airplanes literally fell out of the sky, killing hundreds of people, because prioritizing emotional comfort over harsh, unyielding engineering facts had become the dominant corporate norm.
And to demonstrate how deeply this ideology is being seeded into the future, the author returns to Sweden for a chilling example regarding children. He describes a state-funded Swedish preschool that completely banned the use of the words boy and girl on its campus.
The teachers were strictly mandated to refer to all children using a newly invented gender-neutral pronoun, hen.
The text views this not as a progressive, inclusive educational milestone, but as blatant ideological grooming and psychological colonization. It is the ultimate manifestation of the maternal state utilizing its power to force objective biological reality to bend to its subjective emotional needs, starting with the colonization of the youngest, most malleable minds.
So after laying out this massive, systemic, ruthless architecture of institutional capture and civilizational decline, what does the author actually tell his red-pilled readers to do about it? He doesn't just leave them with a diagnosis, he offers a highly specific, radical solution he calls praxa.
Riker's concept of praxa demands a total, uncompromising paradigm shift for men. The very first step of praxa is the absolute cessation of participation.
The author argues that men must immediately and entirely stop seeking validation from these corrupted, female-dominated systems.
Whether it is attempting to climb the corporate ladder within a DEI-captured HR environment, navigating the emotionally manipulative landscape of modern dating, or participating in the mainstream political apparatus, the text asserts that men are playing a rigged game.
You simply cannot win a game where the rules are entirely based on the shifting, subjective sands of emotional reality.
Right, the text essentially tells men to pull the ripcord and exit, to take their competence, their logic, and their resources and build entirely parallel systems.
The author mandates that these new parallel institutions must be built strictly and exclusively upon the trivium, logic, rhetoric, and grammar. He urges men to aggressively reclaim objective truth as the only acceptable metric, to reward merit relentlessly and without apology.
And above all, to refuse to ever apologize for simply possessing male traits. The core message of praxa is to stop letting weaponized tears hack your biological neurology. demand empirical evidence for every claim of unsafety, and completely reject the collective historical guilt that this hive queen culture attempts to systematically force onto your shoulders.
It is, without question, a profound and absolute rejection of the current Western social contract. The author is actively advocating for a form of intellectual, economic, and institutional separatism.
He envisions a future where men rebuild the robust foundations of classical Western civilization in total isolation from what he perceives as the destructive, feral maternal instinct that has currently hijacked the operating system of the modern world.
Let's take a breath and synthesize the incredibly intense intellectual journey we've just been on. We have completely unpacked the systemic worldview presented in this text. A perspective that looks at the architecture of the modern world and sees an epic, silent, and total war between male-coded logic and feral maternal instinct.
We've explored the infant predator schema that reorganizes our institutions, the deeply ingrained evolutionary warfare of the gossip, shame, and rally triad,
The normalization of the BPD spectrum as our cultural baseline, the biological hack of crybullying, and the ultimate civilization-level war on merit.
and again, to reiterate our show's neutral stance as we conclude, our goal today was simply to map the architecture of this highly influential text within the manosphere. We are impartially reporting on the contents to help you understand the frameworks being debated.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, we always like to leave you with a final, unmentioned thought to ponder that builds on the source material we've just explored.
Here is a provocative question to chew on regarding the author's ultimate solution of praxis. The text advocates for men to exit the current system and build purely logical, parallel institutions based solely on the strict adherence to the trivium, completely stripping away all emotional influence and maternal dynamics.
But if human beings are, at our biological core, inherently social, chemical, and emotional creatures, creatures that literally evolved to respond to pheromones and social bonding, is a purely logic-driven, emotionless institution actually sustainable over multiple generations?
Or would such a rigid system, completely devoid of empathy and emotional cohesion, eventually fracture under the immense weight of its own suppressed human nature? It is a complex paradox regarding the reality of human behavior that is well worth mulling over.
That is a phenomenal question to think about as you process all of this. If you want to dive into the raw source material yourself, read the specific data studies he cites, and understand the full, unvarnished scope of these highly controversial arguments, you absolutely must check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the ebook.
Womansplaining Why Women Are Emotional Terrorists, Authoritarian, and Driven by Power and Unearned Status. It is undeniably a text that will challenge your preconceptions and force you to examine the structural mechanics of society, regardless of your personal worldview.
Make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker at his Substack to read more of his ongoing cultural analysis. And finally, if you appreciated the depth of this deep dive and want us to keep unpacking the most fascinating and polarizing sources out there, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the show. We will see you next time on The Deep Dive.